Hey there, welcome back to Flat Tire Farm. We're an off-grid Alaskan homestead, and today I'm going to teach you how to render down beef fat into pure white tallow that doesn't smell like a dead cow. Now, I will warn you, this video is a little longer than usual, and that's because I really wanted to give you lots of detailed instructions on how to do this process completely. If you get bored out of your mind listening to me, I did put chapters in the video so that you can just forward ahead and skip ahead to whatever chapter you're interested in next. If you can hear the tractor in the background, I apologize. Mr. Reeve is out there moving the snow today, but on with the show. Today we're going to start the process of rendering down this 40-pound case of beef fat into tallow. Now, we get fat for free. We find people that are butchering cows or butchering pigs and don't want the fat. Usually, if they're butchering more than one or two animals, they have more than they could ever use. And so they're happy to give it to us, and we're happy to take it and use it. Now, I'll render down this beef tallow and use it. Sometimes I use it for cooking, but this case specifically I'm going to use for making soap. But just so you know, there's multiple uses for beef tallow. You can grease your leather belt with it if you really want to, I guess. But I've made beef tallow and rendered down pork lard lots of times, and I've used lots of different methods, but I want to show you the one that I found to be the easiest, that makes sense and creates the most clean product. Because for me, I don't want it to smell like the animal it started out being. All right, the first thing we have to do is tackle this fat. You can see some of these pieces are really meaty, and I am very fortunate and then I have a lot of resources for fat. So I don't have to clean all this meat off of here. I can just say, you know, that's probably a piece that I'm going to feed to the pigs or give to our musher friends to grind up and feed to their dogs. I get to be kind of picky. If I didn't have places for the fat to go, or I didn't have lots of resources to get fat, I could cut all those little tiny meat pieces off and then throw only the white fat into my pan that I'm going to render it down in. So this is some nice fat. It has tiny little bits of shards of meat in it. I'm going to take that and throw it. This is my pig bucket, if you were wondering. It's just where I'm going to put all the extra meat pieces that I'm not going to render down. Because you don't want those meat pieces in your rendered down product if you don't want it to taste like cooked beef. And it will taste and smell like cooked beef. Okay? And then I just chop these pieces up. Now, we live off grid, and we could use a meat grinder if we wanted to, but number one, that's a lot of dishes when I have to haul water and don't have a water heater, and two, I don't want to use the power that it takes to run a grinder. So I just chop it up and throw it in the pan. There's like a big old weird chunk. I don't want that. That can go to mushing dogs or to pigs. There's some membrane stuff. I don't want that. I'll just chop it up maybe into no bigger than 1-inch cubes. Now, I'm kind of the quick, fast, and get it done kind of lady, and you could surely spend a lot of time picking through all this and cutting it into little teeny tiny pieces, but we're not going to do that for this video. We're just going to get it done. So let me get all this chippity chopped up and put in my pan, and then I'll meet you back in a little bit and I'll show you the next step. Okay, we got one big stock pot full, and we've made it through about a third of this box. There's a couple hints that I have for you that are helpful when you're processing either beef fat or pork fat, is to keep it frozen. So this case sits outside in our Connex. It's wintertime in Alaska, so everything stays frozen. So I've made it through a third of this box. The top had thawed a little bit because I brought it in earlier today, and the rest of it now is still rock solid frozen. And so I'll have to wait for this to thaw a little bit more before I can keep processing it. You want it about 50-50 thawed and frozen. It's easier to handle. It cuts nice and it doesn't get slippery. Okay, aside from that, I usually cover my cutting surface with newspaper and then put my cutting board down, because the frozen fat will flake off and make a big mess that I forgot to put newspaper down, so I'll have to clean that up before we keep going. And also, you'll see I had gloves on earlier. And an apron. I don't always wear an apron when I cook, but what I do when I'm doing fat, because it gets everywhere. But when I'm cutting the fat, I have one hand one gloved hand that I'm using to grab the fat, and the other one holds my knife. If I used both hands to grab the fat and the fat sticks all over the gloves, it would get all over the handle of my knife, and then as my hand warms up the fat, the handle of my knife would become very slippery and very dangerous. And so I do my very best to keep one really clean hand and then one hand that's for fat moving. But let me get this cleaned up and then I'll show you the next step. Okay, we're all cleaned up now. Now this is the part where people usually differ in terms of how to process the fat. There's always to add water or not to add water. And I really used to be a don't add water kind of a lady, because the goal is that your end product doesn't have water in it. Otherwise it makes the fat go rancid and it spoils over time. And it's much more shelf-stable if it doesn't have any liquid in it. So it made sense to me, don't add the water. However, I don't know what you learned in like 4th grade physical science class, but oil and water don't mix. And so I can add this water in now. This is, I don't know, maybe 3/4 of a gallon of water. And when the fat becomes liquid, then it will float to the top and the water stays to the bottom. And you can pour the oil or the fat off fairly easily without getting any water into it. And so once I thought about that, that made this so much of an easier process for me, because I don't like the long cooking time that it took to make sure all the liquid came out if I did add water. So we add a bunch of water. It doesn't matter how much, just it has to be a lot. Like this is a big stock pot and I added 3/4 of a gallon of water, and I'm gonna add, I don't know, 5 or 6 tablespoons of salt, and that'll help purify it. This is just some Redmond's livestock salt that we grind up and use as people salt. I'll link the video at the end for that if you're interested in why in the world would we do that. Okay, we have our salt and water in there, and that is going to help capture all the impurities. All the impurities are going to get stuck in that salt water, and then the liquid fat's going to float to the top. So now we just have to have a heating source. Now we live off grid, and wood stove is our main source of heat, and we're going to use that for heating this fat up. I could use our propane stove if I wanted, but why would I pay for propane when the wood stove's already cooking away and I can use the heat for free? If you didn't have a wood stove and you didn't live off grid, you could use your regular stove. Doesn't really have to be a super low heat like you do if you don't add water, because nothing's going to scorch at the bottom because you have all the water as your buffer in this. And that's the other thing I really like about this, is I don't have to monitor the temperature, because all that water creates the safety buffer for my fat not burning. You could also put it in a crock pot if you wanted. Whatever heat source you have will work just fine, but we're going to use the wood stove because that's what we got. Okay, now the easy part. We've got our pot on a heat source. That water's going to warm up. It's going to heat up that fat. That fat's going to liquefy, and all the connective tissue or little bits of meat that I might have left in there are going to stay connected, and over time it's going to float to the top. And periodically we'll check in. I'll show you what it looks like, and I'll tell you how long it's been, but this whole entire rendering down tallow process is going to take us a couple of days. Okay, it's only been an hour, but you can see the liquid level is coming up over the fat now. Be a couple more hours and then we'll check in again. Okay, we're at 4 hours, but it's getting pretty late for us, so we're going to put this trivet underneath this pan, and that way it'll slow down for a while, and then it'll stay warm till we get going in the morning again. Well, good morning everybody. Let me show you where we're at. Okay, you can see there's lots of liquid in there. These little fat chunks are flibbity-flobbity and trying to break down a little bit. Now, I was comfortable leaving this on the wood stove overnight because I have this trivet underneath it, which keeps it up off the wood stove, and it can't boil, it can't even simmer, it just stays warm. If you weren't comfortable leaving it on your heat source, like I probably wouldn't leave it on my stovetop overnight, I probably would leave it in a crock pot overnight. But if you weren't comfortable doing that, you could just take it off, let it cool, put it in the fridge, or we live in Alaska, so you can put it outside, and then start it again in the morning. Now, for me, this whole process is going to take about 24 hours of rendering it down, but the time is going to differ depending on your heating source and how high you have it or how low you have it, if you stop in the middle and cool it down like we talked about and start again. But when we get to the point that I'm ready to pull all these chunks out, that's the point that really matters. However long it takes to get to that point, that's how long it takes to render down fat. So this evening, we'll stop and take a look at it, and if it's ready, we'll pull all those chunks out and I'll show you the next step. Okay, it's been exactly 25 and a half hours since we started this project, so let me show you where we're at. Okay, you can see that the little fat cubes have gotten much smaller. Okay, and they're starting to sink down a little bit. Now some people will render this down until all these little pieces get hard. I don't like to do that because I feel like it imparts way too much beef flavor, and in all reality, I don't have enough patience for that. So at this stage, we're gonna start pulling these fat globs out, and so I'll see you in the kitchen in just a second. Okay, now for the least fun and potentially very messy part of the day. We're gonna take all of these little fat globules, all these little flibbity flobbity chunks that are left, and start straining them out. Now I just use this little fry spoon thing first at the beginning to get all of the big chunks out and get the majority of it out. So when I get most of this cleaned out, I'll see you back. Okay, now that I got most of those little fat particles out, I'm gonna use this mesh strainer to get out the last little bit. This is why I use that fry spatula thing first, because it lets the liquid fall through, where when I use the mesh strainer, I have to wait a little bit for all that liquid to come out. And I often have to swirl it around to get all the liquid to contact the mesh edges. Okay, we have one last step of straining all the bits out. And you gotta be really careful because this is really hot. I have a stainless steel bowl and I put my little mesh strainer in there, and I'm gonna pour what's left of this through the strainer, and all the liquid will go into the bowl, and hopefully all of what's left will go into the strainer and not fall in. We'll see. Wish me luck. There we go. Okay. We didn't die, so that's good. Okay, so now we'll take our little mesh strainer and jiggle it around and get the rest of that liquid through the strainer and into the bowl, because all that fat sits on the edge of the mesh and it kind of blocks the liquid from going through. So just like we did when we strained it out of the pan, we'll jiggle it around and let all that liquid come out. Okay, now we have all of our liquid fat, and remember that salt and water is in this bowl too, and all the parts we don't want are in our bucket. And now all we're gonna do is cool this down, and as it cools, the fat's gonna come to the top and solidify, and the water, the salt, and lots of little gooey gunk is going to be in the bottom of our bowl. So I'm gonna just stick this outside to let it cool, but you might stick it in the fridge, and then I'll bring you back and we'll show you what it looks like, and that is my favorite part. Well, it was about 12 degrees when we put this bowl outside last night, and it's about -2 right now. So we actually had to bring this bowl in and thaw it out. But I want to bring you up close so you can see what it looks like. Okay, here's our tallow. You can see it's all white and hard. And the reason I put it in this bowl is because you can kind of flex the edges, and that lets this tallow separate very easily away from the bowl. But that's the underside of it. Look. Ugh. You can see all that schmoo in the bottom. That's all the impurities. It's brown and goopy. It's a little bit actually like bone broth. It has some gelatin in it from breaking those tendons down. All right, back to the table. Now I like putting the liquid in a bowl like this in order to cool it, because this tallow gets really hard, and I did once try to cool it in a stock pot, but then it's like stuck solid in there. And if I use the bowl, I can kind of push the edges a little bit and let it flex, and that'll give me the room to pop that thing out. If you do it in a stock pot and you let it cool in a stock pot, you're gonna have to chisel it out with a knife, and then you get the goo everywhere, and it's not that fun. So there you go. But here's our beautiful hard tallow. That's so cool. Okay, you might be able to see little dark spots and impurities that are still in this tallow, but that's because we're not done getting all the gunk out of it yet. So the next step is, you can see I got smart and put my newspaper down this time, is to just scrape this goopy stuff off. All right, now if you look, you can see that this isn't smooth and there's still brown stuff embedded in this. So we got to scrape it all off. Now you can use a flat knife for this and just kind of chisel it off if you want. But I like to use this serrated knife so I can kind of saw it down. And we're just gonna cut all of that textured stuff off until we get down to nice, smooth tallow. All right, now we'll just take some paper towels and you can kind of wipe all that shmoo off the edges. This had a little well of shmoo in the middle, so I kind of dug that out, but it doesn't have to be perfect just yet because we're not done. Okay, but we did a pretty good job getting most of that stuff off of here. I'll bring you up close and show you. All right, you can see we got most of it off. There's a little bit left right there, but I'm not going to worry about it because we're still going to process it again. Okay, now you just have to chop it up in pieces that'll fit in a pan. This pan's pretty big that I have, so I think if I just break it in half, maybe don't karate chop on television, huh? Well, you can karate chop if it works. Don't karate chop if it doesn't work. Now all we have to do is hack it up in pieces that'll fit in this stock pot. I think we just need a couple pieces for this stock pot because it's pretty big. There we go. Give me just a sec to clean this up and I'll show you the next step. Okay, remember I had the rest of that box to still process. So this is the rest that I've already rendered down the first time, just like this one. So we'll just get them done at the same time now. And we kind of just do the same process. You're essentially rinsing the fat. So I'm just going to put maybe half a gallon of water in each one of these now. Because as soon as this melts down, all that water needs to do is just pull the impurities out. Pull everything out that's not pure fat. We're going to put salt in it again. Same amount. 5 to 6 tablespoons. We'll put it back on the heat source. And this time we don't have to let it render down forever and ever in 25.5 hours. We just have to let it get hot. So maybe an hour on the wood stove. So let me get that going, and then I'm going to meet you back when all this is liquefied again, okay? Okay, these are completely liquefied now. This one has a little bit of chunky stuff on the top, just some tiny bits and pieces. So I'm going to help it out. Just get that stuff off of there. See, just a little bit, but rather get it off now than deal with it later. Okay, we got those skimmed off the top, and now we just dump them back in the bowl and get them to cool down again. I want to clarify what I was talking about when I was talking about it doesn't matter how much water you put in it. In reality, it does matter, but only a little bit. The amount of water that you put in there, you just have to put enough in there so that it's not going to boil off as you're cooking. So that when you're done cooking it down, or you're done rendering it down or warming it back up, that there's still water in the bottom. So you wouldn't want to put so little water in there that when you're rendering it down, it all burns off, because then you're defeating the purpose and your fat's going to burn. So it does matter how much water you put in there. Just put enough in that it isn't going to boil out. Okay? And we're going to chance it here and see if we can get both of these pans of fat in this one bowl. We'll see. Oh my gosh, I can't believe that worked. Okay, so then we let it cool again, and then what we'll do is we'll pop that fat out of the bowl again, and we'll check and see how clear the water is. And basically, we just keep doing this process until the water in the bottom is clear and there's no more schmutz to scrape out. I always do this at least twice, but often 3 or 4 times, depending on what I'm using the fat for. If I'm using the tallow for soap or skin products, I'm gonna clarify it lots of times. But if I'm just using it for cooking, like cooking eggs or biscuits or whatever, then I'm just maybe gonna do it 2 times. So I'll meet you back when this cools, and we'll check and look at the clarity of the water and see if we need to render it again. Okay, so now we're back. We've rendered down fat. We have clarified it once, and this is the second clarification. So let's see how dirty the water is this time. Look at that. we didn't die. Whew. You can see that this water is definitely better than the first clarification. It's not gelatinous anymore, which means we've pulled out all of that gelatin from rendering down those tendons and tissue. And you can see it's a little bit clearer, but still pretty murky. Now, if you were going to use this tallow for cooking, you could probably skip ahead in the video to the final process chapter, but because I'm going to use this for soap, I'm going to clarify it at least 1 and probably 2 more times. So if you can see, here, I'll lift this guy, he's pretty heavy. There's just one little spot now of brown goo bits and parts left. So we're getting it clarified more and more, and we'll do just like we did on the last one. We just scrape that stuff out of there till the tallow is nice and clean again. We'll wipe off the edges. We're going to be a little bit more picky when we clean it up this time. I scraped off a lot more of the bottom. I got all the little chunks off. I'm going to make sure I get everything wiped off the edge. Make sure I don't see any impurities left on this tallow block. And then we're going to put it back in the stock pot and do exactly what we did before. Well, the water's getting clear. Looks like I need to clarify it one more time. Okay, I think we're finally going to get to the last step now. We've rendered down raw fat. We've clarified it 4 times. And so let's see what it looks like after the 4th clarification. Okay, this water is pretty clean now. Look at that, yay. And we just have a tiny little spot on there. Okay, the time has finally come. We have finally made it to the last step. Okay, I scraped that little bit of schmutz that was on there, that little tiny size of a quarter that was on there, and I scraped off the entire bottom, just a very fine layer of it, to get all the last little tiny bits of fine pieces of yuck that still may have been in this tallow. Okay, so we're just gonna split it open. Our last step here is to just get the water out of it now. Now we could put this in the pot and cook it down forever and a day and have tallow that tastes like burnt old beef. Or we could use our 4th grade science that we talked about earlier and know that when this fat becomes a liquid, it won't mix with the water and they'll separate. We're just gonna put a little bit of water in there, stick it back on the stove, and all we have to do is heat it up till it liquefies, and then I'll bring you back. Okay, we have our tallow all liquefied now, nice and warmed up. Any water that was trapped in that solid tallow has now been able to separate from the liquid fat and go to the bottom, as well as the little bit of water that we added. So now we're going to pour this into a clear measuring cup or any clear container you can use so that we can see what is oil and what is water, and that will help us make sure we don't get any water in the vessels that we want to store. What we do now is we just let it sit for a moment, give it a minute or so, and the water and the oil should separate if there's any water in this. So I'll show you that up close. Okay, we've let it sit for just a minute now, and you can see that the oil's on the top and the water's at the bottom. Now this water line is really helpful for us. It shows us where the oil is and where the water is. And remember, we don't want to get any water in our long-term storage vessels for this tallow. So all we have to do is pour and watch the water line and make sure that the water doesn't go in there. Now you can see that as we're pouring, the water kind of settles into the bottom of the measuring cup. So as long as you're really watching, you won't have any problems. Then when it gets really close to the spout, I'm going to stop and I can pour this off into another vessel. See, there's just a little bit left in there. And if I wanted to be brave, I could get a little bit more out, but I don't want to get any water in this tallow that I'm going to make for soap because I want it to store long-term downstairs. When I get to the tiny little bit of oil and water that I'm not sure how to separate out, I'll pour it into another vessel and I'll deal with that in a little bit. And then we just go again. We'll let it sit for a minute. Wait till it separates, pour off the oil, dump the water and a tiny bit of oil into that other vessel, and then I'll meet you back when all of this gets separated. Okay, looks like we're getting close to the end here. I have just this last little bit left in my I'm Not Brave Enough vessel here. I'll stick this in the fridge. When the top solidifies, I'll just take that little puck of fat out and tallow, and I'll use that for cooking in the next week or so. Okay, now we just have to let this cool and it'll turn into hard, beautiful white tallow. Okay, here it is all beautiful and hard and ready to store. You can see there's no water in the bottom. We did good. Couple of tidbits here at the end that you might have been concerned about. You might have been concerned that the salt gets stuck in the fat, and if you're going to make soap or cook or use it for face products, that you're going to end up with salt in it, and that's not the case. The salt actually stays suspended in the water, and as long as you don't get any water in your final vessel that you're pouring into, no salt will be in your tallow. And also remember, on that last round, we just added plain water and we didn't add any salt. In terms of yield, as in how much did we get, we started with a 36-pound box of raw beef fat. Remember in the beginning, we cut out all the funky, chunky bits of beef and weird membranes and stuff, and we got rid of all that at the beginning, and that probably was about 10 pounds of stuff that we filtered out right away. And then as we rendered it down, there was still connective tissue and all those hooey-gooey bits that we got out. And so in the end, the final product, the amount of solid pure tallow that we ended up with, which was about 12 pounds. So that's not too bad for free and free. In terms of storage, as long as you make sure you didn't get any water in here, this tallow is going to last you a really long time. If you are concerned that maybe you did get water in there or you're not really comfortable with leaving something like this on the shelf without refrigeration, you can put it in your fridge. It'll last you like forever and a day. But I keep this tallow and lard that I've rendered downstairs in our pantry that stays about 50 degrees most of the time, and I don't have any problems with it. I have some lard that's at least 2 years old that is still perfectly beautiful as the day we processed it. If you have any comments or questions because I missed something in this very, very long video that I tried to cover everything imaginable, leave it in the comments below and I will make sure to get back with you on that. Thanks for toughing it out with me till the end. We appreciate all your support here at Flat Tire Farm. Stay tuned for the next video, guys.